Hey, what's up, y'all? It's Dr. Manny. Welcome to Asylum. So, the idea I'm exploring, I'm messing with the live video because, in theory, people enjoy live video more. So, whatever. Um, so, the core idea I'm looking at is the concept of bad decisions. Because you always hear people encourage you to make better decisions. And it's like, okay, first of all, if you don't have a set of parameters to decide what determines a good decision and bad decision, hey, what's going on? So Tony. um, so if you don't have a set of parameters in place to decide what is a good decision or what is a bad decision, in the end, you have no way of measuring, and as such, you have no system for improving your decisions going forward or becoming overall a better decision maker. So, in order to get a clear idea of what constitutes a bad decision, it's the the root strategy is to get to the root cause and ask yourself, what is the state of mind that leads to a bad decision? Because any given decision, if you look at how there's plenty of software that emulates decision making now, and the artificial intelligence is getting smart enough where it can actually predict the circumstances under which you will make a poor decision. And a lot of cases, marketing uses this to their advantage. So anyone who works in marketing knows that the two ways to get someone to make an impulsive decision is to use scarcity and to use urgency. Scarcity being the trigger in the prospect of the person considering the purchase. Scarcity is creating the sense that if they don't, that there's only a limited amount of that item. If anyone watching a commercial, a late night infomercial to sell you, what is it, a ShamWow or whatever, you're familiar with the little ticker at the bottom where the number shows it running down. We have 5 left, 4 left, 3 left, whatever. That's one way to trigger someone into a bad decision. Second way is a sense of urgency. Hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. That leads to making a decision that doesn't take into account priorities, creates and they call this fight flight based decision making. The reason it's a bad decision is that in fight flight, anytime your brain is in, your sympathetic system is activated, you're essentially looking at a situation in which your values are changed. Ideal decisions are made, best decisions are value aligned decisions. So these are decisions that take into account your identity, your character, your long term narrative arc, and how you want your story to read on your deathbed, for lack of a better frame. The way your brain experiences this is, hey, Dr. Shade, how are you doing? The way your brain experiences this, since your brain uses values for making decisions, for doing, it's called Bayesian inference. It's a calculation system that does a prediction of what the outcomes are most likely to be in a situation, and does what's an algorithm called regret minimization. We experience it as, well, if you sit and are mindful enough to learn, regret is the one state in your mind that is the state that does the most reprogramming of your previous memories, the way you remember things, and therefore the way you make decisions going forward. So the problem is, though, we make bad decisions usually in urgency and scarcity, which are a set of negative emotional states. Urgency, you can automatically imagine it triggers that fight flight in your brain, so it makes you feel as if you are under threat. Hey Jason, how's it going? So what you end up with is a decision that doesn't take your values into account. You guys have heard me already talk about amygdala hijack. Amygdala hijack is a process in which you're stuck in your past stories and memories. It might be identity threat. In a situation, you're not looking what's empirically there. What you're looking at is past stories, a fear of being kicked out of whatever tribe you imagine yourself to be in, social comparison, a whole bunch of how does it look when I say this, do this, or act in this particular way. And so you end up in that state, you end up making a decision that instead of being about getting the actual outcome or getting to the place that you want or minimizing how much you're going to regret later, which, minimizing how much you're going to regret later. I'll say comma so I can digress a bit. Usually, the regret in a lot of times comes as you sit down, settle out of that fight flight state or out of that state of rush, that impulsive state. And then that's the point at which your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that keeps self-related memories, higher order thoughts, when that part of your brain kicks back online, that's when your values become accessible in your mind. You start thinking, to use a simple example, this is when you regret impulse purchases, buyer's remorse. This is when people who are not like sociopathic career criminals might feel a little bit of guilt. You get a little bit of a cortisol bath where you feel, "Hi, Dr. Andrea, how you doing?" So this is the point at which your prefrontal cortex kicks back online. And once your prefrontal cortex kicks back online, that's where your brain stores the values that it uses for computing self-relevant decisions. So you feel a bit of a pain and you feel a bit of loss. That loss you feel is the best way to imagine it is that your brain holds memories about you in sort of an autobiographical file. Good to see you, Dr. Andrea. Thanks for dropping by. Your brain holds this autobiographical file of your life and your memories and what it's supposed to be like. By and large, that autobiographical file is stored in identities. In my case, there's a doctor identity, there's a software engineer identity, there's a dad identity, there's a writer identity. Each of those identities has a story that when you adapted that identity, a role that you took in it. What you getting for lunch? You got me wanting to eat now. So you're at the core, on a subconscious level, you're comparing yourself to, you're comparing your current behaviors to progress in each of these identities, their story arc. So where that comes into making bad decisions is sometimes the version of the story for the identity that leftovers, that doesn't tell me what it is so I can sit here and want some. Is it like, is it rice? Is there rice? Is there meat? Hey Gerard, how you doing, bro? Good to see you. So at the core, you're born, and before you gain full awareness, you already have a certain set of values, a certain set of preferences that when you look back as an older person will have formed a bit of a narrative arc. Hey Todd, how's it going? Good to see you. So within that story, within that narrative, this is how your brain holds all information, because otherwise it's way too jumbled. It's a bunch of causal relations, a bunch of associations, and you feel them emotionally based on these beliefs that you have, some of which are values. Turkey dressing, corn, looking for identity outside of medicine. Absolutely. That's key for sanity. You know, I had to do that myself and still doing it every day. Yeah. So when you adopt this identity, initially we adopt these identities on a subconscious level, as a combination of values that our parents put into us, with the belief that this would make us as effective in society, as likely to be successful, effective, admired, respected, and valued. Now, the problem with that, and this is no insult to parenting or culture, is that that identity, that narrative, was one that was likely handed down over the generations to them, and as a result of their accumulated experiences. Hey, baby bro, what's going on? So what you have is a situation in which a person internalizes these narratives, and within that narrative is a set of rules, predictions, expectations, essentially. Now, when you step into that narrative and you take on one of these roles, going forward, your story, what you imagine, your score at the end of the life game, you imagine it based on that role, and the aspects of the facets, dimensions, depending on which word you want, that were associated with being an effective execution of that role. Very much like if, oh, you guys could understand roles. Basically, if you're watching a movie, you expect each character to act according to their role, and as such, you apply that to yourself. Any decisions you make along the way, after you've taken on that identity, albeit a little bit of a flawed container for your information of your autobiography, you along the way you evaluate your self-worth based on how you perform on these facets of the role. Now, bad decisions in this context can take one or two forms. Your regret comes from, in some cases, um, your short-term regret can come from identifying with and choosing a wrong role. That happens if when you were initially learning the opportunities available to you in society, what was accessible, what was admirable, your culture, I call it tribes of origin, the uh, the culture from which you emerged has had a limited perspective. Like, we grew up pre-internet, so pre-internet you couldn't just Google a bunch of careers, and as such, in my case, it was like I want to be well off, I want to be an admired member of society, and I love science. Doctor. Uh, I couldn't go through a long list of biomedical engineer, biomed company, VC. Uh, it there wasn't that menu of items. So these are bad early decisions. Now, in addition to picking a wrong role, and I won't say wrong because it gets shaky when I call medicine a wrong role, because whatever. I won't even go down that rabbit hole. But when you make these initial decisions, there's a sunk cost concept where moving along the pathway, you have identified with this role, and anytime you jump into a role, the role is within a tribe, a group. A tribe has a characteristic called entativity. It's a big word that means how sticky being a member of that tribe is, and how much how much the expectations of the tribe are that you will stick within the definitions of the role. It's sort of a this is how we do this in this tribe. Um, the harder and the longer the training is to be a member of a particular tribe, the the more the decisions run the possibility of becoming dogma within a bit of a parallel universe, because the tribe, it's got its own rules, it's got its own norms of inclusion, own norms of exclusion. So as far as in your identity arc, even when you're not around tribe members, um, your core decision making, your axiomatics, the way in which you process reality, the way in which you filter reality, the way in which you prioritize even sensory perception and storytelling and how you see social context is based around that training. Now, I talked about the initial bad decision, the possibility of adopting a tribe. The second set of bad decisions can happen as a result of the limited awareness that comes with becoming effective and efficient within the limited consciousness of any given identity group, especially a high entativity group. Remember that high stickiness, because um, remember I mentioned earlier that when you go into fight, flight mode, fight, flight, freeze, faint, if you want to talk about all four facets, there's a possibility that you'll go into fight, flight, freeze mode can be triggered by identity threat. If you're in a group that has that does a lot of fear-based conditioning um, to keep you within the tribe, and guilt-based conditioning, and I was raised Catholic, so that would be a tribe that in the past has a reputation for guilt-based conditioning. Hey Vaughn, how are you? Thanks for joining. So if you were raised in one of those tribes, uh, your decisions in the present often involve what they call injunctions. Injunctions are rules that you don't ask questions about. Um, and rules that essentially a lot of times involve sacrifice, involve suffering in the moment. These are the ways these things are done. Now, the problem with this is that in your mind, what's essentially happening is that these things that you learned are identity based constraints on the edge of your consciousness. And as such, since every decision is made from a level of awareness, it impairs the level of awareness with which you are able to make a decision. Now, beyond that, it sets up a set of limiting beliefs that not only do they limit your decision, limit your range of consciousness, they further limit the likelihood that you're going to ask a question to further elaborate your understanding such that you're able to make decisions from a different perspective. These core ideas, they make for bad decisions that aren't able to adapt to feedback. Okay. Now, what happens along the way is during your maturation process, you you're unfolding the narrative of you. You're learning more and more who you are, and at some point, you're going to have these drives inside that will lead you to start asking questions about how certain things are done, because we all outgrow the tribe of origin at some point. Depending on the amount of negative emotion, fear-based conditioning, often cultural conditioning, cultural indoctrination, depending on how painful it is to make decisions at that edge, you're often likely to get knocked back into a state of conformity, as opposed to a state of further self-expression, further self-discovery, further expansion of your consciousness is what a lot of people like to call it. So those are sort of your bad decisions in the context of internal causes of bad decisions, because I've touched on the external causes at the beginning: scarcity, urgency, a lot of marketing. What marketing does, now that I've explained the internal aspects, is often what marketing can do is push a guilt trigger based within your belief system. And this is identity strategies, basically. And you heard of identity politics. People vote their values. We also make our other decisions based on our values. And I've discussed earlier in here that you have different values when your higher self, your best self, is how people like to say it, as opposed to the values you have under duress. Now, why this is super important is you often hear that people, after they hit bottom, that's when they'll learn, quote unquote. What happens when you hit bottom is that reality kicks in, and you pretty much get to where you're like, well, I have nothing to lose. Now, one of the things that often happens with people on the way to the bottom as they're falling, and at the bottom, is that it's easy to stay in that fight flight mode where you say to yourself, I'm only doing this in this situation. This is where someone who's likely to steal or commit a crime and convince themselves that they'll make a better decision later. But the reality of it is that the learning that takes place during that fear-based, that high flight situation is such a visceral limbic learning that it becomes part of your core software. Going forward, anytime you're in that situation again, you're going to go back into fight flight, and that's the whole concept of being triggered. Traumatic memories, flashbulb memories, certain memories are so intense that they short circuit the whole, even considering, let me reflect on this, let me look at the pros and cons. You do the thing that worked during survival time. This is all fear-based conditioning does this to your decision making. Trying to make sure I'm covering all the aspects of what leads to the bad decisions. Now, so to flip frames a bit, because I think I've covered all aspects of that. If not, then obviously I'll integrate it into other discussions down line. But the goal then is, how do you make better decisions? When someone's saying make good decisions, what do they mean? Essentially, there is a switch that flips in your mind where at decision time, they say remain present, remain conscious, make deliberate decisions. At decision time, the more effective you are at returning to what they call your higher self, returning to your higher self, so that your prefrontal cortex kicks back on, so that the part of your brain that represents your higher values, the part of your brain that remembers who you are and how you want to be in the long run, activates your core values, activates your story. And what that does is, in your mind, it decreases what they call the salience of any temptation or any threat along the way. In a threat situation, this is when someone manifests the courage of their convictions. That's when someone does the right thing, no matter how hard the situation is. They went down fighting for what they believed in. In a temptation situation, it decreases the salience of whatever tempting stimulus, so that your brain is going to pick the one that it sees as having the highest payout. That's how your brain makes decisions. It weighs two possible outcomes, the likelihood of you getting one of those two outcomes, getting the two outcomes, and which one's most likely, and then what you find is you develop a motivation towards one of the two. If you even have a chance to create the choice in your mind. Now, downline from that, to geek a little bit, on the other side of it, as soon as you make that decision, your brain clamps down in a way that it's called choice-induced preference. The fact that you make the decision, the right decision, immediately, not even the right decision, any decision you make is immediately rewarded in your brain for having made a choice. It's called choice-induced preference. You're going to like whatever you chose right after you chose it more than the other thing, even if they were identical. Now, if what you chose to do is something that involves multiple steps or involves a longer curve, some action, some perseverance, some more multiple decisions along the way, as long as you're stepping through those aspects, you're able to keep in mind what your higher purpose, your larger outcome is. You're in your mind, you're doing you're creating meaning. That's the definition of creating meaning, because those memories, when they come back up later, when they're activated by environment, when you're telling the story to people, those are the elements where you feel a sense of agency, you feel a sense of self-efficacy, you feel a sense of pride. What happens is any decision you make, and this is literally the definition of a bad decision, any decision you make that is aligned with those values increases your self-esteem, increases your self-worth, makes you feel as if you're more competent. It develops a sense of confidence, and with each decision, you get better at making subsequent decisions in that same range, as opposed to every time you make a decision where, as a result of not having thought, not even having noticed that there was a decision opportunity because you were so pulled by the temptation, those drop your self-esteem, drop your sense of agency, drop your sense of self-efficacy. And in the end, as you accumulate these little cuts to your sense of autonomy, you lose ambition, you lose drive, and in the scientific literature, they call it loss of intrinsic motivation. So you end up, if it gets bad enough, you end up burned out, and you get something called learned helplessness. In the background, you get that cortisol inflammation, and that if you have that chronically enough, what happens is there's a blood-brain barrier. The chemicals, the different, there's a bunch of stuff floating around in your blood that there's a blood-brain barrier that protects it from crossing over and interfering with your thought process, your memories, and really the narrative, the story you tell yourself about who you are. When you have low-grade stress long enough, that cortisol, which is a stress hormone, float around in your blood, it crosses the blood-brain barrier and it goes in your brain and changes. There's a part of your brain called the default mode network. The name doesn't matter. But the key thing is that's where your brain stores the story of who you are. If that part of your brain is exposed to cortisol uh, due to early life stress, it rewrites the story in your brain, and it rewrites the story with an external locus of control. It leads to you going forward making bad decisions, but projecting your power outside of yourself with the story that uh, the devil made me do it. This person pressured me into it. I didn't have enough time. I didn't even know that was an option. You get to the point where you become better at making excuses and telling stories than at noticing opportunities in the environment for furthering your goal. Take it even further, in a lot of cases, you'll have people who go into victim and villain mindset where, because they perceive that the world is such a an imposing force, that they turn to a life of crime. They turn to some people internalize it. They drop their self worth to the point where they just end up immobile, just not motivated to do anything, not able to express themselves, and just able to see in this world as this nihilistic, just negative thing. Other people flip it out and just end up becoming this toxic, angry, aggressive person that just takes out all the stuff on the world because they perceive the world to be such a threatening place. So now, what I want to point out is these fit into the framework of bad decisions because they become such a collection of bad decisions that they become your character. They become, you lose the ability to spot uh, this is a bad decision, this is a bad decision, this is a bad decision, this is a bad decision. You lose that ability because, as a means of storing the information in your mind, like I said, uh, you develop an external locus of control where you no longer even recognize that these were decisions you could make. These were choices you could make. So when you hear people talking about happiness as a choice um, and taking full responsibility, what they're talking about is stepping back and realizing that even these stories, any story that you tell yourself that has this embedded sense of scarcity, any story that projects your autonomy outwards, any story of blame, any story where you're angry at someone and the focus of the story is no longer you building this intentional arc to your desired outcome, this intentional arc to an expression of your best self. Any story that gives you permission to take these detours to do things that could possibly use up resources that should have gone towards this big picture outcome, those are by definition these bad decisions. Any detour that ends up burning bridges, ruining friendships that could have that would have been long-term, lifelong relationships for this path. And a lot of the lifetime, like life narrative stuff, they refer to, they use a metaphor called the hero's journey. Anything that results in you burning bridges that would have been potential allies on this hero's journey, those are forms of self-sabotage. Uh, Anything where you're off to the path, to the side, doing stuff that's not contributing to any of your identities is a bad decision. Now, it's easy to be like, well, that's asking me to live some boring life of whatever. No. What it's doing is empowering you to be more intentional, be more aware of your higher order values, choose identities and activities that honor those higher values. Uh, Increasingly clarify your core values and pick careers, hobbies, and things that, such that when you're doing them at a higher level, you're honoring your values. And what's important about this is a lot of the integrative mental health stuff is coming to play with this. You often hear the whole work-life balance. There's no work-life balance. What's more important is a work-life integration in which you've picked and engineered the things that you do in such a way that when you're at work, the work you're doing is it's, I think the word they use is avocation. It's the work itself is an expression of who you are at a deeper level. When you're in your parenting role, perform that in a way that it reflects your higher values. If you're and really in that part with the parenting aspect, what you're doing is you're propagating those higher values by signaling them in your choices and your behaviors, because you can tell a kid all the rules you want, they're watching closely and they're learning tacit learning from you. In jobs, in work, in business, choose enterprises that the impact they have is in alignment with your values. The branding around your business should be a distillation and amplification of your own personal brand if you choose entrepreneurship as opposed to working with a company. If you're choosing to work with a company, a lot of us, well, I'll speak for myself. There was a time when I was making hiring decisions. I was making decisions as to which company I was working with, and this was after medicine when I was in software. Uh, I would build whatever. I spent a few years building casino software, making that stuff addictive as hell. Because it was like, oh, they were like, oh, you know behavior modification. I'm like, yeah, and they were like, we have the job for you. So it was, how do you make these slot machines and these other things hit uh, on a visceral, subconscious way, so that the person continues to perceive that they have the best chance of winning. That because people stop playing at a machine when they hit a certain frustration. But I digress. Point of that being that the numbers that casinos were paying and that video game companies could pay me at the time for making stuff more addictive, there was a video game boom, especially a Facebook game boom back in the day when I was building Facebook games. It paid very well. So at that point, the decisions I was making, I was picking work that wasn't necessarily in my overall alignment, because I'm one where the more marketing I learn, the more against this triggering and persuasion of people into doing things under identity threat that I've become. So when you making a decision as a choice of employment, you're supposed to step back and look at the values of the organization, see the direction and the narrative that the organization tells. Hey, Peter, how's it going? But one of the things that often comes into play in a bad decision in this case is money. Picking a money position as opposed to a position in which, when you're at work, the stuff that you're building, you feel as if the impact of it is good. Ideally, you pick a position somewhere where the culture of the organization nurtures you such that you feel safe, you feel as if you belong, you feel as if you're thriving, and as such, your brain develops faster, and you create, as I mentioned earlier, every time you make a decision that's in alignment with your values, you end up, I imagine it as adding a page to the narrative of you. Anytime you make a decision that's driven by other things like externally, extrinsic rewards, things that are in conflict with your values, you drop your self-worth to a certain extent. Good to see you. So I say those aspects right there because what's important is all decisions are made in the moment. All actions and choices are made in the moment. That's all you have. So in a context in which the goal is to train yourself through a set of steps so that you're making the best decisions in the moment. The way that manifests, the way that ends up happening, the way that ends up showing up symbolically, gesture-wise, speech-wise, thought-wise, action-wise, and narrative-wise, is that you end up living a life that's in alignment with your stories. You end up, and stories and your values. You end up with a narrative arc that at the end of it, when you look back, you've done the things along the way with kind of low effort with a lot of them, because they become habits, they become identity rituals, they become ways of being, they become you attract people who share those values, who share that decision making style, and you end up surrounded by a tribe of people who actually support your decision making, who nurture the things you want to accomplish, and as such, as a whole, as a collective, you end up moving towards your larger, your broader, not even objectives, but your larger life mission more effectively. So, my hope is that this discussion didn't just dot the, oh, this is how to make a quick, good decision, blah, blah, blah. It goes deeper than that, is the point. The point is, your decisions are founded on your awareness of the bigger picture of where you fit into this larger um, biosphere, this larger biosystem, and as such, how each decision, each choice affects the people around you, affects your likelihood of success in longer goals that you might not even be aware of, affects your likelihood of having the resources, having the awareness, and having the preparedness when other opportunities emerge on the horizon, such that you can take advantage of them. So as such, this is a much longer view of this decision making and what constitutes bad decisions and what constitutes good decisions. All right. So, Dr. Manny, I'm out. Thanks for checking me out at the asylum.